All right, welcome back to our video series on abnormal psychology. We're going to pick up where we left off by looking at some classifications of mental illnesses and look at some examples that you might find within those categories. Starting first with anxiety disorders. And as they sound, we're talking about disorders that somehow link to things like anxiety, worry, fear, apprehension. This could be physical responses such as twitching and moving, hyperactivity, or certainly the cognitive functions of thinking and worry and dread and fear. We do find that of all the categories of mental illnesses we could talk about and will talk about in this chapter, anxiety disorders are the most commonly diagnosed disorders in the United States. They exist throughout the world, but we have the highest percentage of them, which is something kind of interesting, especially when we look at some of these examples. Let's start first with generalized anxiety disorder. And as it sounds, it's a pervasive sense of anxiety that doesn't seem attached to any specific thing or object. It has to be persistent for several months. Your body will respond with muscle tension, fatigue, stomach problems. But again, it's generalized, meaning it's not that I'm really worried about this one thing. It's just a pervasive sense of dread about many of life's possible variables. As far as causes go, there have been several ways we can look at it. And throughout the rest of these, I'm going to try to give you options of biological and psychological or sociological reasons that might be leading towards this. It has been linked to a deficiency in the neurotransmitter GABA. We have seen in terms of cognitive psychology that people with generalized anxiety disorder often have very harsh self-standards, perhaps brought on by very strict, very critical parents or teachers. Basically, they grew up in an environment where they were taught to constantly fret and worry about themselves and what's going to happen to them. Panic disorder is a bit different because often it can be a response to a specific targeted event, but it doesn't have to be. You can have this sudden onset of worry or apprehension without warning and not have a cause at all. Again, the difference from the previous one is we're not talking about a general or pervasive sense of dread about all things. It's a sudden explosion of fear and worry. And you have many of the similar physical responses we mentioned before, on top of things like respiratory issues, palpitations, chest pain, sweating. As far as possible causes, similar neurotransmitters like GABA and norepinephrine have been looked at. We have wondered if there's a neurological issue in terms of perception. So let's say that the sympathetic system, nervous system is kicking in, that fight or flight is kicking in at points or situations where it shouldn't. And even sociologically speaking, we wonder if there's maybe just a learned response, a learned level of fear. For example, women are more likely than men to experience panic disorders or have a panic attack, as you've probably heard of them, certainly versus men. So perhaps just living in a world that still favors the patriarchal response to where violent crime, women are still more likely to be victims than perpetrators of that. So perhaps cultural parts do affect this as well. Phobias is something you're already familiar with. It's that paralyzing fear, but it's not a typical fear. It's an unreasonable or irrational fear. A fear of something that should not cause you dread or worry in this moment, but does. About 10% of the U.S. suffers from a specific phobia. We've looked at everything from the amygdala, which processes emotions, perhaps over-registering or misrepresenting information and therefore having overactivity. We also mentioned in our chapter on learning that most phobias seem to come from conditioning, probably accidental conditioning. You were at the wrong place, wrong time. Unfortunately, we did mention experiments like Watson and Little Albert where that was intentional conditioning and did create a phobia. Social anxiety disorder is one that should be familiar to quite a few of you, especially if you've ever taken a speech class. It's a fear of being humiliated or embarrassed in social situations, sometimes referred to as a social phobia. It certainly does seem a height in adolescence. We wonder if in part because it's we do see increases in serotonin regulation in adolescence. There also has been evidence to show that cultural patterns such as parental styles, look at basically parental focusing, how they expect their child to act, sort of going back to those general anxiety disorders where we create a situation where you have very harsh self-standards, very critical of yourself, very nervous that people are judging you, and perhaps that's because you've been conditioned to fear or to respond to that stimuli. Obsessive compulsive disorder is one that's a little bit misrepresented in the media, but it's worth talking about, also an anxiety disorder. Obsessions are ideas, but they're ideas that can't be stopped. Compulsions are the behaviors that are repetitive and also can't be stopped, or at least both of these are very difficult to do so. Occasionally I'll hear someone say, I'm a little bit OCD, and what you probably mean is you're a little bit anal. You like organization, you like order, you have certain patterns that you like to operate by, but it doesn't mean you're OCD. Obsessive compulsions are rarely enjoyed, they're rarely liked, they often bring distress, possibly even harm to the person. I gave you examples here like excessive checking, cleansing, counting behaviors. As far as possible causes of obsessive compulsive disorder, everything from frontal lobe misactivity to high stress events. If you've ever seen the movie The Aviator, which was about Howard Hughes, and though it is a film, it does some fairly accurate representations of how high stress situations trigger this obsessive or compulsive responses. Now recently the DSM-5 has added some new versions of OCD behaviors that you might have heard about, such as hoarding, excoriation, which is skin picking, trichotillomania, which is hair pulling, and any body dysmorphic disorders such as body dysmorphia if you studied working out or eating or dieting in excess to create the perfect body. Those sound very similar to obsessive compulsive disorders. We'll revisit this last one in a bit when we talk about eating disorders. Post-traumatic stress disorder is another one I bet you've heard about. Certainly it's part of the media, PTSD as we often refer to it. It typically is that heightened anxiety, fear, or any other responses similar to this category, typically brought on through flashbacks. Sometimes it can see a reduction in emotional response, the ability to feel or interact in a normal social circumstances. It's probably based on the traumatic event itself, and so in terms of memory encoding, what's happening is those memories are resurfacing at opportunities when they should not, and so the sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight, once again kicks on when it shouldn't. And so in moments where you should not feel fear or dread or worry as if there's danger, you still can't help but doing so. Alright, I'm going to cover one other category in this video. We'll talk about mood disorders. Alright, now mood, as it implies, has to do with emotions or emotional states. So mood disorders could be someone stuck in a certain emotional state from a very high to a low, or it could be individuals that move up and down on that extreme. Now we'll start first with the low, and that's depressive disorders. An unrelenting lack of pleasure in life. It's typically quite a bit of sadness, feelings of loss and grief. It's a lack of interest in things that normally bring you pleasure, and if you look at some of a self-esteem point of view, it's a feeling of worthlessness. Major depressive disorder is the disorder that we classify, again, not just being depressed, which is a normal human response to loss, but stuck in that place, stuck in that spectrum for a period of time. The National Institute of Mental Health regards this as the leading cause of disability in the U.S., meaning that being stuck in the spectrum alters your behavior to such an extent that your normal physical and behavioral functions are disabled. Possible causes of depression, we do see less activity in the prefrontal cortex. We do see a reduction in serotonin, which is why some medications, as we'll see in the next chapter, address regulating serotonin. Sometimes depression is linked on a conditioned response. We mentioned learned helplessness in Chapter 5 on learning. And maybe perhaps even the social circumstances are so pervasive and powerful that we can't seem to leave that state, such as being stuck in poverty, experiencing a trauma that's so severe the normal process of grieving isn't enough to deal with those issues. Now, mania, on the other hand, is the exact opposite end of the spectrum. You're stuck at the high highs, and at first that may seem like a good thing, but unfortunately that euphoric state can lead to some very difficult, if not dangerous, behaviors. Bipolar itself is sort of alternating on the depression and manic spectrum. So you have high highs and low lows. There is some evidence that it exists in children, though we're really hesitant to diagnose it in children because typically adult interventions involve medications which might not have been tested for children. So you have those low lows, the sadness, the depression, the grief, or you have the high manic episodes. And again, it may sound like it would feel good to have the high highs, but that can be very disruptive, disorganized thoughts. You can engage in some very dangerous, even deadly behavior based on your overconfidence or misrepresentation of the issues around you. There is something called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, which has sort of become a version of bipolar in children that we're not specifically calling bipolar, and we won't treat the same way as bipolar, but it's basically referencing the idea that some children, beyond the normal disruptive behavior and the normal, pushing boundaries, may have a reoccurring levels of irritability, of resistance towards authority behaviors, even to the point of being so out of control their behavior is unpredictable and dangerous. Now, suicide is one of those topics that should be talked about when we talk about mood disorders, because ultimately when we think of things like depression or bipolar, we worry about men and women hitting those low lows to such an extent that they can't escape, and they feel the only way to end their misery is to, in fact, end their life. Over 35,000 people commit suicide each year in the U.S., and 500,000 people receive medical care for attempting it. Typically, when we have men and women who have attempted suicide, the vast majority do have a diagnosable mental disorder, such as mood disorders, anxiety disorders. Now, what leads some of us to be more suicidal than others? Biologically speaking, we mentioned things like neurotransmitters being low and affecting mood. There is evidence that suicide runs in families, and so that may lean towards genetic predispositions, such as frontal lobe or reduction in frontal lobe activity. That's impulse control. Psychologically speaking, if we've been abused, have high stress situations, or have poor social connections, that could lead towards not developing certain psychological or environmental connections. In terms of sociocultural, we do find that there are social markers that may predict higher or lower rates of suicide. For example, there are certain ethnicities that are more or less likely to end their life than others, so that speaks of a cultural bias there. We find that women are more likely to attempt suicide, but men are more likely to succeed. Again, that seems to be a cultural component. Women are more likely to use methods that are, in some cases, able to be stopped or halted in an ER situation, such as overdosing on medications. Men are more likely to use methods such as jumping off a building or shooting themselves, which has a much lower rate of recovery in terms of catching that and surviving that trauma. We also find that things like social norms, there are certain religions, and while many of them don't specifically address suicide, there are some cultures in the religion that are so anti-suicide that those messages become strong enough to perhaps deter some people from ending their lives. There are quite a few myths about suicide, and I'm just going to address 3 common ones that I often hear just to sort of straighten up our opinions and ideas on the topic. First, I've heard people say that if you talk about suicide or you reference it, that you somehow aren't really serious. If you really wanted to kill yourself, that you wouldn't tell anybody so no one would stop you. And that seems to be untrue. The vast majority of people who have committed suicide have discussed it, maybe not with the people that needed to know. Maybe it was a friend or an online forum, or through correspondence with someone. But typically we do make attempts, or we start talking about it. So if you do know someone who's talking about it, we always should take it seriously. Secondly, and this is a very common myth, if someone tried to kill themselves and failed, they weren't really serious. It was attention-seeking behavior. That's absolutely untrue. The vast majority of people who attempt to kill themselves and fail will attempt again unless intervention happens. It's rarely a case of attention-seeking. And even if that is the case, I still argue that person has a mental health situation and is in desperate need of care. Third and finally, only life's losers commit suicide, meaning the poorest of the poor, those of you who've lost loved ones or bad breakups. Unfortunately, we find that there is no real good predictor in terms of vocation or success. There are a number of men and women who have great jobs, large families, good income, and they still end their lives. This often happens in terms like celebrities, where we'll see someone who's very famous, very well liked, has a lot of money, but still struggles with very difficult conditions. I do have on page 60 a neat little checklist of what to do, what not to do if you believe someone is suicidal. So those of you who have read ahead, it's a good little checklist if this is something relevant to you. All right, we're going to stop there. When we'll come back, we'll tackle eating disorders and move through the rest of the chapter. See you then.